Big Shaq returns home, only to find a stranger at his door, armed with papers claiming his family's legacy. Constance Haraway's smile hides something darker. Secrets buried under legal trickery and whispered lies. In a town where loyalty shifts like sand, Shaq stands alone against a web of betrayal. But just as he thinks he's been outmaneuvered, a shocking truth about Constance's past threatens to flip everything. Will Shaq reclaim his home, or will the shadows of Willow Creek swallow him whole? Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung high over Willow Creek, casting a golden hue on the town's quaint facades and winding streets. Big Shaq's black SUV rolled into town, its polished exterior reflecting the midday light. He hadn't been back in years, not since his mother's passing. The house on Sycamore Lane stood as a testament to his family's legacy, a sprawling Victorian, with ivy-clad walls and a wraparound porch. As he stepped out, the familiar scent of pine and distant barbecue filled the air. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby park, and wind chimes tinkled softly in the breeze. Yet, beneath the town's picturesque surface, an undercurrent of unease was palpable. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, their eyes lingering a moment too long. A jogger on the sidewalk offered a curt nod before quickening her pace. Shaq approached the front door, the key fitting effortlessly into the lock. Inside, the house was just as he remembered, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows, the scent of aged wood, and the faint aroma of his mother's favorite lavender sachets. He wandered through the rooms, each holding memories of family dinners, holiday gatherings, and quiet evenings by the fireplace. In the kitchen, he found a note on the counter. "Welcome home, Shaq. We've missed you." It was unsigned, the handwriting unfamiliar. He furrowed his brow, sensing something amiss. The refrigerator hummed softly, and the clock ticked steadily, but the house felt different. Later that afternoon, Shaq decided to take a walk through town. He passed the old diner, where the waitress hesitated before offering a forced smile. At the hardware store, the clerk avoided eye contact, mumbling a greeting. Even the barber, who used to regale him with tales of the town's history, seemed distant. At the town square, a group of residents had gathered for the annual summer fair. Colorful tents lined the streets, and the aroma of funnel cakes and grilled corn wafted through the air. Shaq approached a booth, but the vendor's smile faltered upon seeing him. "We're closed," she said abruptly, despite the open sign hanging above. Confused and disheartened, Shaq returned home. As he ascended the porch steps, he noticed a woman standing at the edge of his property. She was dressed impeccably, her posture rigid, eyes narrowed. "Can I help you?" he inquired. The woman tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "I was about to ask you the same," she replied. "This house belongs to me." Shaq's heart skipped a beat. "I'm sorry, but this is my family home. It's been in our name for generations." DistinctlyMontana.com. She produced a document from her purse, holding it out with a gloved hand. "According to this, I purchased this property last month. Perhaps there's been a mistake." He took the paper, scanning its contents. The signature at the bottom was unfamiliar, the details meticulously crafted. A chill ran down his spine. "I suggest you vacate the premises," she continued, her tone icy. Before things get complicated, Shaq stood his ground, the weight of his family's legacy pressing heavily upon him. He knew something was deeply wrong, and he was determined to uncover the truth. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Willow Creek, Shaq realized that his return home was just the beginning of a deeper, more sinister journey. Shaq had barely settled into the familiar creaks and comforting warmth of the house when a sharp, almost rehearsed knock echoed from the front door. His stride, once steady and grounded in the pride of his homecoming, faltered just slightly as he approached the entrance. He opened the door to reveal a woman who stood with the precision of a judge, delivering a sentence. Constance Haraway. Her name carried the weight of old money and deep-seated entitlement. Though Shaq had never seen her face before, she wore a tailored, cream-colored suit, her pearl necklace gleaming in the afternoon sun, and her thin smile curved like a blade.
"Mr. O'Neill," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp. "I believe we have a misunderstanding."
Shaq's eyebrows drew together, but he kept his tone polite. "I don't think we do. This is my home, has been for generations." Constance's lips twitched into a smirk that didn't reach her eyes. From her polished handbag, she produced a crisp stack of papers and extended them toward him as though she were handing him an invitation rather than a confrontation. According to this documentation, this house was sold to me last month by a company you apparently no longer have ties to. I'm afraid you're trespassing. For a moment, Shaq could only stare at the papers. The name of the company leapt out at him. A subsidiary he'd divested from years ago. One he thought had been legally untangled from any connection to his personal holdings. His pulse quickened. "There's a mistake," he said, voice tightening as he took the papers and scanned them, finding signatures and seals that looked all too authentic. His heart dropped a beat when he realized the fine print seemed to favor Constance's claims. "I assure you, there's no mistake," Constance said with a sweetness that felt poisonous. "I'd appreciate it if you could vacate the property by tomorrow. I'd hate for this to get messy." Shaq's breath hitched, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of it. "Messy?" he echoed. Constance's eyes gleamed. "Oh, I'm sure you understand how the law works. And public opinion. You've always been a notable figure. It'd be such a shame if this disagreement made headlines, wouldn't it?" Her words were a trap, laid with an expert hand, polished and practiced, her confidence bolstered by something more insidious than simple legal maneuvering. Shaq sensed it. This wasn't just about a property dispute. It was about control, about pushing him out of his own space, his own legacy, with a smile and a signature. Refusing to let her rattle him, Shaq stepped aside just enough to block her view of the interior. "This house belonged to my mother, and her mother before her. You think a stack of papers and a smug attitude can erase that?" Constance's smile widened, though her gaze sharpened. "It's not about erasing, Mr. O'Neill. It's about legality, ownership. The courts don't care about sentimentality." The statement stung, not because it was entirely untrue, but because it spoke to a larger truth. Shaq had always known, but hoped he'd never have to face so blatantly, that for people like Constance, people whose power wasn't earned but inherited, justice was a tool to be wielded, not a principle to be honored. "I'll have my lawyer review this," Shaq said, folding the papers neatly but firmly. His voice was even, though his hands were beginning to tremble slightly, with the weight of a dawning realization. "I'm sure you will," Constance said with a nod, stepping back but leaving her presence like a stain on the porch. "But just know, I have the upper hand, and the town knows it too." Her parting words hung in the air long after she turned and sauntered down the walkway, her heels clicking like a countdown. Shaq stood frozen in the doorway, the papers in his hand feeling heavier than they should. He watched her disappear into a waiting black sedan, parked just beyond the property line, its tinted windows reflecting the perfect blue sky. Inside, he paced the living room, his mind racing. The subtle hints of hostility he'd felt earlier, the too polite smiles, the hushed whispers, the way old friends had suddenly turned cold, clicked into place. Constance's claim wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of something deeper, a web of manipulation and quiet collusion. He sat heavily in his mother's old armchair, its fabric faded from years of sun and use, and tried to steady his breathing. His phone sat on the table beside him, but every attempt to call his lawyer led to voicemails. His calls to colleagues went unanswered. It was as if the moment Constance made her move, the people he trusted vanished into thin air. For a fleeting moment, doubt crept in. Maybe it was a mistake on his end, a technicality overlooked. Maybe he'd trusted the wrong hands to manage his affairs. But the certainty of Constance's smug expression told him otherwise. She wasn't playing fair, and worse, she knew she didn't have to. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long slashes of shadow through the windows. Shaq stood and walked to the bay window, looking out over the manicured lawn that his mother had tended with care, the rose bushes blooming defiantly against the encroaching twilight. This was his home, his roots, and Constance's claim wasn't just about property, it was an attack on his very identity. As he stood there, the first whispers of resolve stirred within him. He wouldn't be cowed, wouldn't let veiled threats and legal trickery push him from what was rightfully his. But he also knew he couldn't confront this head-on without a plan. He needed to be smarter, sharper, and more resilient than ever. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, leaving the house bathed in the soft, eerie glow of dusk. The day's warmth faded, but the tension in the air remained thick, palpable. Shaq glanced at the papers again, their fine print dancing in the dim light, a silent challenge waiting to be answered. He set them down carefully, his jaw tightening as he whispered into the silence of the room. "Not today." As he moved through the house, turning off lights and preparing for a sleepless night, a heavy stillness settled over Willow Creek. But in Shaq's heart, the seeds of defiance had been planted. Constance Haraway might have thought she could twist the law and bend the town to her will. But she hadn't counted on the resilience of the man she was trying to erase. And tomorrow, Shaq knew, would bring more than just a legal fight. It would bring the unveiling of the layers of deception that had begun to crack with the simple knock of a stranger's claim. The morning light seeped into the house like a false promise of clarity, but Shaq felt its warmth more like a spotlight exposing cracks he hadn't noticed before. His calls to his lawyer, first thing after sunrise, had gone unanswered, voicemails filling up like sand in an hourglass. Each ring that ended without a response heightened his unease, as though unseen hands were tightening a noose. He sat at the old oak dining table, the silence of the house pressing down like a weight, staring at the papers Constance had handed him the day before. Every page was a mockery of truth, lines of legalese stitched together into a weapon meant to rob him of his family's legacy. The knock at the door this time was softer, almost apologetic, but the sight that met him when he opened it was anything but. Constance stood flanked by two uniformed officers, both men from the town he'd once thought of as home. Officer Reed, tall and lean with a jaw set too tight, shifted his weight as though uncomfortable, while Officer Burke, shorter and stockier, kept his eyes averted. Constance, in her pristine beige suit and gloves that looked too delicate for any real work, held a folder under her arm, her expression schooled into mock concern. "Mr. O'Neill," she said smoothly, "I've taken the liberty of notifying the authorities, given the confusion surrounding ownership." She handed the folder to Officer Reed, who hesitated only briefly before taking it, and leafing through the documents with a frown. Shaq clenched his fists at his sides, the tendons in his arms standing out like cables. "These papers are forged," he said, his voice low but steady. "I never authorized any sale. This house has been in my family for decades." Reed glanced up, meeting Shaq's eyes but quickly looking away, as if he couldn't hold the weight of Shaq's quiet fury. "Mr. O'Neill, we understand your concern, but these documents appear to be legitimate. If you have legal representation, it might be best to resolve this through the courts." "That's what I'm trying to do," Shaq snapped, his voice sharp enough to make Burke flinch. "But suddenly my lawyer's not answering. And these documents," he gestured to the folder, "shouldn't exist. They're fabrications, plain and simple." Constance let out a soft, condescending laugh. "It's understandable to be upset, but we're simply following the letter of the law. I've provided proof of ownership, and until a court says otherwise, I expect the matter to be respected." Her words, wrapped in civility, stung more than outright hostility would have. Shaq's pulse thrummed in his ears, but he forced himself to breathe slowly, to keep his voice even. "You're manipulating the system. This isn't just a paperwork error. Someone's behind this. Someone who knew the right levers to pull, the right palms to grease." Reed shifted again, uneasy. "Mr. O'Neill, we aren't here to pass judgment. We're just here to ensure things don't escalate." "Escalate?" Shaq's voice echoed through the quiet neighborhood, sharp but controlled. "You think I'm gonna throw a punch? That's not who I am. But don't expect me to just roll over and watch my home get stolen out from under me." Constance's smile tightened. "I would advise caution with your words. You wouldn't want to appear confrontational." Her tone was laced with a subtle threat, a warning cloaked in civility. Shaq inhaled deeply, the air tasting bitter. His gaze flicked from Reed to Burke, searching for any hint of solidarity, any flicker of doubt. Burke's mouth opened as though to speak, but a sharp glance from Constance silenced him. It was clear, whatever pull she had in this town extended further than Shaq had imagined. The officer's hesitation wasn't born of personal bias but of fear, of connections that ran deeper than mere paperwork. "I'll leave you to consider your options," Constance said, stepping back with the poise of a queen, relinquishing her court. "But I'd suggest you vacate by evening. It would be smoother for everyone involved." Shaq stood rooted to the spot as the trio turned away, the officer's shoulders hunched as though burdened by invisible chains. He watched them retreat down the walkway, Constance's heels clicking against the stone like a metronome counting down to some inevitable conclusion. His throat was dry, his mind racing with fragments of plans, possibilities, and the stark realization that he was being boxed into a corner. He slammed the door shut, not in anger, but in defiance, and leaned heavily against it, his breath shuddering in his chest. The house felt different now, as if the very walls had absorbed the tension of the confrontation. He moved through the rooms with a newfound urgency, opening cabinets and drawers, searching for anything: old deeds, receipts, letters, something that might prove the truth of his claim. In his mother's old desk, tucked beneath stacks of yellowed recipes and handwritten notes, he found a thin, worn folder. Inside were copies of the original deed, notarized letters from decades past, and photographs of his family standing proudly in front of the house. His hands trembled as he sifted through them, the weight of history pressing against his palms. These were more than just papers. They were a legacy. But would they be enough? His phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a single text lighting up the screen. No luck getting through. They're stonewalling. It was from an old friend, someone he'd trusted to reach his legal team. The realization settled in Shaq's gut like a stone. He was being shut out from every angle. The sun dipped lower, casting long, creeping shadows through the house. Outside, the town continued its quiet existence, unaware or perhaps willfully ignorant of the battle unfolding behind closed doors. Shaq stood in the living room, the worn papers clutched in his hand, and felt a quiet resolve building beneath his frustration. This wasn't just a property dispute. It was a calculated move, a chess game where he was being forced into check. But Shaq wasn't the type to concede. He would find a way to prove the truth, to reclaim what was rightfully his, even if it meant unraveling the threads of a deeper conspiracy, even if it meant standing alone against the tide. As the last light of day slipped away, Shaq's silhouette stood firm in the window, a silent sentinel ready for the fight ahead. As the afternoon sun cast long, slanting shadows through the windows, the silence of the house deepened, thick with unspoken words and unhealed wounds. Shaq stood in the middle of the living room, the faint scent of lavender from the old sachets his mother used, still lingering faintly in the air. It was as if the house itself was trying to remind him of its true story, its rightful lineage. He traced his fingers over the carved oak mantel, the grain worn smooth by decades of family gatherings, birthday candles, and holiday wreaths. This house wasn't just timber and paint, it was a living testament to the resilience of his family. He let himself sink into the old armchair by the window, the very chair where his mother, Lucille O'Neill, had once sat while shelling peas or reading the Sunday paper. He could almost hear her voice, calm and commanding, telling him about the struggles she faced as a young woman, a black woman in a world eager to dismiss her worth. Lucille had fought for every inch of respect, every ounce of dignity, raising her children to know that no one could take from them what they knew to be true. The house, this house, had been her dream, a home where her family could thrive without fear, a fortress against a world too often marred by prejudice. The memories came in waves, vivid and unbidden. Shaq saw himself as a boy, chasing his sister down the hallway, their laughter echoing through the rooms. He remembered Lucille's steady hands smoothing the edges of the wallpaper, her determination to make the house beautiful, despite tight budgets and long workdays. He recalled family dinners where voices rose in animated conversation, and the aroma of cornbread and collard greens filled the air. This house had been their sanctuary, their statement that no amount of disdain or dismissive glances from the outside world could dim their pride. Now standing at the precipice of losing it all to a woman who wielded fake papers and veiled threats, Shaq felt a rising tide of grief and resolve. The weight of his ancestors' sacrifices pressed down on him. He could almost hear his mother's voice, low and firm. "Don't let them erase us, baby, not like this." He stood abruptly, the chair creaking beneath him, and made his way down the hallway to the back room, the one that had served as Lucille's sewing nook. The door creaked open, revealing shelves lined with fabric bolts, old photographs, and keepsakes. He pulled open a small chest and found it filled with mementos, letters his grandfather had written to Lucille from the army, brittle with age but still legible, a family Bible with inscriptions dating back generations, photographs of Lucille standing proudly on the porch with his father, both of them beaming with the quiet triumph of hard-earned stability. Each artifact whispered a story of perseverance and dignity. It wasn't just about ownership, it was about identity. Shaq's family had built their lives in the face of a society that tried, over and over, to push them aside. Every nail hammered into the walls of this house was a declaration that they belonged, that their roots ran deeper than any legal document could claim. As the light shifted, he sat at the sewing table and leafed through a stack of faded blueprints and receipts tucked in a folder labeled "Home, Our Legacy." His mother had kept meticulous records, dates, payments, renovations, all annotated in her careful script. One note in particular caught his eye: "Keep these safe. They'll try to say it's not yours, but they can't argue with history." Lucille's foresight struck Shaq like a physical blow. She had known, somehow, that one day someone might try to erase their presence, to rewrite the truth. He gathered the folder, holding it to his chest as if it were a shield. The warmth of the sun pressed against his back, and he turned to face the window, watching the shadows grow longer on the manicured lawn. His mind replayed every moment of his mother's quiet defiance, her refusal to leave a restaurant where she was unwelcome, her persistence in organizing neighborhood meetings to discuss community issues, her unwavering belief that dignity was not something granted by others, but claimed by oneself. Constance Haraway's cold smile and polished threats were nothing compared to Lucille's iron will. The contrast between the two women was stark, one driven by entitlement, the other by resilience. Shaq could feel his mother's presence in the walls, in the very bones of the house. This wasn't just about legal ownership, it was about justice, about honoring the generations who had fought too hard to be erased by a forged signature and a whispered rumor. His resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let Constance manipulate the narrative, wasn't going to stand by while his family's history was trampled underfoot. He would honor Lucille's legacy, not just by fighting for the house, but by exposing the lies and injustices that had allowed this scheme to unfold. As dusk painted the sky in hues of gold and rose, Shaq stood once more in the living room, the folder of evidence in his hand. He no longer felt like a man trapped by circumstance. He felt like a guardian of something far greater than himself. The echoes of his family's past filled the house, not as ghosts but as reminders of the strength and love that had built it brick by brick. The doorbell rang again, sharp against the quiet. Shaq's pulse quickened, but this time, he didn't hesitate. He squared his shoulders and strode to the door, ready to confront whatever new twist awaited. He was done feeling powerless. He was done letting others dictate the narrative. With his mother's lessons burning in his mind, and the weight of his family's history pressing against his spine, Shaq opened the door, prepared to face the next move in this battle for his legacy. The morning after Shaq's confrontation with Constance and the arrival of the police, Willow Creek seemed to shift, as if the entire town had silently decided to rewrite its rules overnight. The air still held the scent of summer blooms and freshly mowed lawns, but now there was something heavier beneath it, a thick tension that wrapped itself around every word unspoken and every glance averted. Shaq noticed it first in the way neighbors who once waved without fail now turned away before their eyes could meet his. As he stood on his front porch, coffee cooling in his hands, he watched a woman he recognized from the PTA, the same woman who'd once asked him to sponsor her daughter's soccer team, cross the street hastily with her gaze fixed on her phone, pretending not to notice him. A man who used to jog past his house every morning slowed down, glanced his way, then took a sharp turn into a side street. These weren't strangers, they were familiar faces who until yesterday had shared small talk, borrowed tools, exchanged pleasantries over backyard fences. Now they were silent witnesses to his sudden fall from grace, murmuring behind closed doors about the scandal that had landed on their quiet street. Shaq could almost hear their whispers swirling around him like a gathering storm. "Did you hear? Apparently he doesn't even own the house anymore. I always knew there was something off about him, too rich for his own good. Well, you know how these things go. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding, but you can't ignore the paperwork." He took a slow sip of his coffee, bitterness coating his tongue, and leaned against the porch railing. It wasn't just the loss of easy camaraderie that stung. It was the speed with which people distanced themselves, as though proximity to his unraveling might somehow stain them. Even the local shopkeepers, who'd once greeted him with warm smiles and casual jokes, now offered only curt nods or avoided his gaze altogether. The whispers weren't confined to backyards and street corners. At the town square where a weekend farmer's market had drawn its usual crowd, he overheard snippets of conversation as he browsed the stalls. "Did you hear about the O'Neill Constance Haraway's stepping in. She says it's hers now. He's always been a little too big for this town, if you ask me. Maybe it's about time someone put him in his place." The words slithered through the air, each one tightening the invisible net around Shaq, making his presence feel heavier, more conspicuous. Even his longtime acquaintance, Frank Delaney, the owner of the local auto shop who'd once called Shaq brother without hesitation, now seemed guarded, his jovial tone replaced by clipped sentences. When Shaq approached him at the market, Frank's shoulders stiffened, and he glanced around nervously before speaking. "Hey Shaq, look, I don't know what's going on, man, but maybe it's best to let the lawyers handle it. You don't want to stir things up too much." The words felt like a slap, an admonishment disguised as concern. Shaq's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He knew pushing back would only fuel the rumors. make him seem defensive or confrontational. He left the market without buying anything, his presence leaving a wake of murmurs that seemed louder than when he'd arrived. As he walked back home, the town's familiar landmarks, the diner with its neon sign, the library where his mother used to volunteer, the church steeple rising above the treetops, felt like they belonged to someone else's story. At home, the silence felt oppressive. He sat at the kitchen table, the morning light slanting through the blinds, illuminating the papers Constance had presented, and the old documents he'd found tucked away in Lucille's sewing room. His phone buzzed intermittently, texts from acquaintances who offered vague words of sympathy or advice to stay quiet and let the situation blow over. None offered real help. None dared to stand by his side. Shaq ran a hand over his shaved head, exhaling a slow, measured breath. The isolation wasn't just social, it was psychological. The whispers were designed to erode his confidence, to make him question his own legitimacy. But he wouldn't let them. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, clear and resolute. When the world turns its back on you, you stand taller. You hold your ground. You don't let them tell your story for you. By afternoon, the whispers had evolved into cautious, calculated avoidance. Neighbors who once leaned over fences to chat now tended to their gardens with studious concentration, their backs turned to him. The mail carrier, usually cheerful, left letters in the box without a wave. The town that had once celebrated Shaq's success, the hometown boy who'd made it big, who'd given back, who'd sponsored school programs and community events, had become a place where his every move was scrutinized, every word dissected for signs of weakness or guilt. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of gold and rose, Shaq stood in his front yard, watching the shadows lengthen across the neatly trimmed grass. He could feel the weight of the town's silent judgment pressing against his chest, but he also felt something else, a simmering resolve. If Constance thought she could isolate him, turn the community against him, she was mistaken. He'd seen firsthand how quickly a crowd could turn, but he also knew that truth, when revealed, had a way of cutting through even the most insidious whispers. He turned and walked back into the house, his steps measured and deliberate. The whispers in Willow Creek might have been growing louder, but so was his determination. The battle wasn't just for the house, it was for his family's name, his mother's memory, and his own dignity. And he wasn't about to let a web of lies and veiled threats write the ending to his story. The evening sky over Willow Creek had darkened into a rich cobalt blue, and the house's interior lights cast long shadows that stretched like reaching hands across the walls. Shaq sat at the dining table, his mother's folder of records splayed out before him. The documents, though carefully preserved, now felt flimsy against the storm of legal maneuvering and social whispers, threatening to engulf him. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper, dust, and the faint aroma of the jasmine-scented candle Lucille used to light when the days felt too heavy. The knock at the door this time was softer, almost reluctant. Shaq rose, heart tight with an odd mixture of hope and apprehension. Maybe, he thought, someone had finally come to stand by him. But when he opened the door, he found Preston Hale standing there, a man Shaq had trusted for years. Preston, with his salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a voice that had always dripped with persuasive charm, looked uncharacteristically disheveled. His eyes flicked nervously around, as though he expected someone to be watching. "Shaq," he began, his voice low and urgent. "We need to talk. Inside." Shaq steps back wordlessly, allowing Preston into the house. The door clicked shut behind them, cutting off the world outside. Preston hovered near the entrance, glancing at the folder on the table, but not meeting Shaq's eyes. "What's going on, Preston?" Shaq asked, his voice measured though his pulse quickened with an unspoken dread. "Why are you here now after ignoring my calls and texts for days?" Preston's lips pressed into a thin line. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Shaq recognized as a nervous tic. "I didn't want it to come to this. I swear, I didn't. But you need to know the truth before things spiral even further." Shaq's fists clenched, knuckles whitening. "What truth?" Preston finally met his gaze. And in his eyes, Shaq saw the weight of guilt, and something sharper, fear. "I've been working with Constance. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was supposed to be a quick deal, a transfer of some rights, through the company you left behind. Just on paper. I didn't think it would touch you directly." The admission hit Shaq like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat, the betrayal unraveling his thoughts in a flood of disbelief and anger. You sold me out? He said quietly, his voice trembling not with rage but with the rawness of wounded trust. Preston stepped forward, hands raised in a placating gesture. It wasn't about you. It was business. Constance offered a deal that was too good to refuse. Fast money. Clean cut. I didn't think she'd go this far. Didn't think she'd target you personally. Shaq's jaw tightened as he struggled to keep his composure. You didn't think? He echoed bitterly. Or you didn't care? Preston flinched. I made a mistake, okay? I got greedy. But now it's out of control, and she's pushing for more than I ever agreed to. She's talking about filing charges, pushing for a full takeover. I didn't sign up for that. Shaq's hands dropped to his sides, his body sagging under the weight of Preston's confession. The man he'd trusted with his business affairs, the one he'd considered almost family, had been the architect of his downfall. The forged documents, the sudden disappearance of legal support, the whispers in the community, it all traced back to Preston's betrayal. I can't believe you, Shaq said, his voice low and raw. I trusted you with everything. My mother's legacy, my family's home, and you sold it out for a quick payday? Preston's face crumpled, but his words were defensive, almost desperate. I thought it would be easy. I thought she'd walk away once the papers were signed. I didn't think she'd push it this far. You know how persuasive she is. She's got connections I didn't anticipate. Shaq took a step closer, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the room. Connections? Or did you just underestimate what this house means to me? To my family? You let her turn you into her puppet. Preston's shoulders slumped. I was wrong. I see that now. But we can fix this. I'll testify. I'll give you everything I have. We can turn this around. Together. Shaq stared at him, the weight of 1,000 memories crashing down. Business meetings where they'd clinked glasses in celebration. Phone calls where Preston had assured him he'd handle everything. Moments of shared trust that now felt like distant echoes. You think your testimony will undo the damage you've done? You think the community will listen to a man who betrayed his own partner? Preston's voice cracked, desperation seeping through. Please, Shaq. I didn't come here to beg. I came here because I don't want her to win. You're right. She's manipulating the system, twisting the truth. But if we work together, we can expose her. Shaq felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He wanted to scream, to throw Preston out into the night, to cut ties with the man who'd betrayed him. But he also saw the cracks in Constance's facade, through Preston's confession. The twist was more than a personal betrayal. It was an opportunity. Preston, for all his faults, had the inside information Shaq needed. He drew in a slow breath, his voice low and measured. You're going to give me everything you have on her. Every email, every meeting, every document. If you hold back one detail, you're done. And you're going to make a public statement. Not for me, for the truth. Preston nodded shakily, relief and fear mingling in his eyes. I'll do it. I promise. Shaq turned away, the weight of Preston's confession settling like iron across his shoulders. He felt the burn of betrayal, the ache of disappointment. But beneath it a flicker of strategy emerged. This wasn't just about hurt feelings. It was about reclaiming control. He wouldn't let Preston's greed and Constance's schemes destroy everything Lucille had built. As Preston left, the door closing softly behind him, Shaq stood alone in the dimly lit room, staring at the family photos on the mantel. His reflection in the glass seemed darker. The betrayal was a twist he hadn't expected, but it was also a crack in Constance's armor, a way to turn the tide in a battle that was far from over. And Shaq was ready to fight, not with fists, but with The night air had settled thick and still around Willow Creek, wrapping the town in a hush that was almost deceptive in its calm. Inside his family's home, Shaq stood by the window, watching the streetlights flicker and cast long shadows across the quiet road. His thoughts churned like a storm-tossed sea, each memory of Constance's smug threats and Preston's confession cutting through the silence like a jagged blade. He felt the weight of his mother's legacy pressing down on his shoulders, but for the first time in days, it wasn't crushing him. It was bracing him, propping him up as he straightened his spine. He turned from the window and crossed to the dining table, where Lucille's folder of records lay open. The papers, deeds, receipts, annotated blueprints glowed softly in the light from the overhead fixture. His mother's careful handwriting filled the margins, her notes meticulous and precise. Shaq ran his fingers over the ink, feeling her presence in every word, every line drawn to secure her family's claim to the home. He realized then that this wasn't just about defending what was his. It was about honoring the battles his mother had already fought, the quiet wars she'd waged against a system designed to overlook people like them. He pulled out his phone and started calling, not his official legal team, who'd conveniently disappeared into silence, but friends and contacts from his network, who'd once owed him favors, old classmates who'd grown into legal advocates, local leaders whose respect for his family's contributions ran deep. The calls were brief but pointed, and while some hesitated, others agreed to meet and talk. He felt the tide begin to shift, however subtly. It wasn't a surge of support, not yet, but the first stirrings of resistance against the narrative Constance was trying to cement. Moving through the house with renewed purpose, Shaq searched for more than just paperwork. He opened closets and boxes long sealed, uncovering personal letters his mother had exchanged with city officials, community leaders, and neighbors. Some contained promises made, others revealed unfulfilled agreements, silent evidence that could link Constance's current power plays to past manipulations. In one box, he discovered a small tape recorder wrapped in an old handkerchief, labeled in Lucille's script, "For when they come for what's ours." His pulse quickened as he rewound the tape and listened to her voice, steady and clear, recounting instances where Constance's family had tried similar schemes on other homeowners in the past. Her voice was a balm and a clarion call, stitching him back together with every word. He made copies of the tape, tucked the original into his pocket, and gathered every document, letter, and photograph that could lend weight to his case. It wasn't just evidence, it was a narrative, a counterattack rooted not in anger, but in truth. As dawn's first light crept across the sky, Shaq sat at the kitchen table, exhausted but galvanized. He had mapped out a strategy, one that combined legal recourse, public exposure, and the leverage of community dynamics. He knew how the town operated, how whispers could morph into truth if left unchallenged. So he would flip the script. He'd use the very network of gossip that had once sought to isolate him as a tool for revealing Constance's manipulations. He drafted a statement, carefully choosing his words, not defensive, not accusatory, but confident and factual. It spoke of his family's legacy, of the evidence he'd uncovered, and of his determination to see justice prevail. He emailed it to key community members, knowing it would ripple through the town faster than any formal announcement. Along with the statement, he included a few scanned pages from Lucille's records, and a snippet from her recorded message, a preview of the deeper truths he planned to reveal. As midday approached, Shaq arranged a meeting with a local journalist, a woman named Tessa Greer, who had once interviewed him for a profile piece on his philanthropic efforts. She'd always struck him as principled and sharp, the kind of person who could smell a story worth telling. When she arrived at his home, she was wary but curious. He laid out the evidence, letting her listen to his mother's voice, watch the shift in his expression from anger to resolve. Tessa's eyes widened as the pieces fell into place. "This isn't just about property," she said quietly. "This is about exposing a pattern of exploitation that's been going on for years." Shaq nodded, the tightness in his chest easing for the first time since Constance's arrival. "Exactly. And I'm not going to let her get away with it. Not this time." By evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Shaq felt the shift in momentum. Tessa's preliminary report was already stirring interest online, and a few neighbors, those who'd once kept their distance, had sent quiet messages of support. It wasn't a wave, but it was a beginning. He knew he had to tread carefully, not to push too hard too fast, but he also understood that time was his greatest weapon. Constance's confidence was built on the assumption of his silence, his isolation. But now she would see he wasn't alone, and he wasn't defeated. As he stood on the porch, watching the first stars prick the evening sky, Shaq felt the weight of his mother's teachings settle firmly into place. This was his turning point, not a moment of surrender, but a calculated step into the light. With truth as his weapon and resolve as his shield, he was ready to fight, not with fists, but with every tool, every voice, and every ounce of determination his mother had instilled in him. The battle for Willow Creek's truth had just begun, and Shaq was stepping onto the field, no longer as a victim, but as a force ready to reclaim his legacy. The air in Willow Creek felt electric, as if the quiet streets and manicured lawns could sense the storm about to break. Shaq sat at the long oak table, the glow from his laptop illuminating his face as lines of digital documents scrolled across the screen. He had barely slept, but exhaustion had long since given way to adrenaline. What he uncovered was a web more tangled than he could have imagined. Hidden records, silent partnerships, and a legacy of manipulation that stretched far beyond the walls of his family's home. At first it was small details, discrepancies in Constance's property claims, odd overlaps in business filings, unexplained transfers between shell companies. Shaq's contacts, stirred into action by his determined calls and Tessa Greer's early report, had started digging. One name kept surfacing, Margaret Connolly, a name that on paper didn't seem connected to Constance Haraway. But with each link they uncovered, a shocking picture emerged. Margaret Connolly was the name Constance had used decades ago, long before her carefully curated persona as a respectable community figure was established. Further digging revealed old property disputes eerily similar to Shaq's situation. Families, mostly black, some immigrant, all vulnerable to subtle coercion, had lost their homes through suspicious legal maneuvers. Each case ended with Constance, or rather Margaret, acquiring the properties through technicalities few could challenge. The legal firm tied to these acquisitions was one Preston Hale had quietly represented in the past, a connection that now seemed far from coincidental. Shaq felt a bitter knot form in his stomach as he read through notarized statements from former homeowners, people who had been silenced or ignored when they tried to speak out. His mother's quiet foresight suddenly made sense. Lucille had known Constance's type, had perhaps even crossed paths with her schemes long before Shaq became the target. One letter from a man named Raymond Epps, dated almost 15 years ago, detailed his family's eviction from a home under circumstances nearly identical to Shaq's. The pattern was undeniable, and now, finally, it was out in the open. As dawn's first light painted the sky in muted gold, Shaq felt a shift inside him, not just anger but a profound sense of clarity. Constance's carefully constructed identity was a facade, a brittle mask covering decades of calculated exploitation. She wasn't just a wealthy woman with a sharp legal team, she was a predator who had turned systemic bias into a personal profit engine. Her polite smiles and veiled threats were the tools of someone who understood exactly how to navigate a system that was all too willing to let her succeed. With the evidence consolidated and organized, Shaq reached out to Tessa, urgency threading through his voice. When she arrived at the house, her usually composed demeanor cracked with shock as he laid out the full extent of the revelations. "This is explosive," she murmured, scanning the documents and photos, listening to the clips from old interviews where Constance had denied any wrongdoing in past disputes. "She's been running this scheme for years, hiding behind different names, pulling the strings, always just out of reach of accountability." Shaq's jaw tightened, his gaze hard. "Not this time. This time we're bringing it all into the light." They drafted a detailed exposé, combining the testimonies, financial trails, and undeniable proof of Constance's double life. The report was more than just an indictment. It was a story of resilience, of how one man's fight for his home had uncovered a rot beneath the town's polished surface. Tessa promised to run it in the morning edition, but Shaq knew that wasn't enough. He needed to confront Constance directly, to look her in the eye and let her know that her days of silent victories were over. That afternoon he learned she would be at a local charity luncheon at the Willow Creek Country Club, a gathering of the town's elite, the same crowd that had turned a blind eye to her tactics for years. Dressed in a crisp, understated suit, Shaq arrived at the event uninvited but undeniable. As he walked through the doors, conversations hushed, eyes turned, and the subtle shift of bodies signaled his presence. He spotted Constance near the grand piano, a flute of champagne in hand, her expression composed but her eyes narrowing as he approached. "Mr. O'Neill," she greeted coolly, though a flicker of unease crept into her tone. "I didn't expect to see you here." Shaq's voice was low, but carried the weight of every betrayal, every lie. "I'm sure you didn't. But I thought you'd want to know that your past has finally caught up with you." For the first time, a crack appeared in her polished veneer. "I don't know what you're talking about." Shaq stepped closer, his tone even but laced with iron. "Margaret Connolly, Raymond Epps. The properties you stole, the families you ruined, the lies you wrapped in legal jargon, and polite smiles. It's over. We have the proof. You can't hide behind paperwork and connections anymore." The air in the room grew heavier, the murmurs around them rising like a tide. Constance's eyes darted, her grip on the champagne flute tightening until her knuckles turned white. "You're making a scene, Mr. O'Neill. I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself further." Shaq's smile was slow, deliberate. "No, Constance. The only one embarrassed today is you, and the whole town will know by tomorrow morning." Her composure wavered, and for a brief moment, the weight of her carefully constructed lies seemed to collapse inward. Without waiting for her to respond, Shaq turned and walked away, leaving a ripple of stunned silence in his wake. As he stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, the breeze felt cooler, sharper, like a promise of change. The weight that had been pressing against his chest for days lifted, replaced by a steady determination. Constance's secrets were no longer hidden, and the story of her deceit was finally poised to break through the silence that had once allowed her to thrive. By midday, the sun blazed high over Willow Creek, casting sharp, unyielding light across the manicured lawns and gleaming white facades that had long masked the town's undercurrents of secrecy and suspicion. In front of Shaq's home, a growing crowd had gathered, drawn by whispered invitations and the tantalizing promise of a revelation that would shatter the carefully curated peace of the neighborhood. Shaq stood at the top of the porch steps, the familiar weight of his mother's house at his back, and the eyes of the town upon him. He wore a simple, well-tailored suit, the cut clean and precise. There were no microphones, no media crews, just the townspeople, shifting nervously, their murmurings weaving through the air like the rustle of dry leaves. Shaq had called for this meeting through carefully placed messages and quiet conversations, understanding that public confrontation in broad daylight would leave Constance no shadows to hide in. Constance arrived fashionably late, as if she could stage manage the optics of her arrival. She stepped from her sleek black sedan, in an immaculately pressed cream-colored suit, her hair styled into a flawless coif. Her usual tight smile was strained at the corners. As she took in the size of the crowd, larger than she likely expected, faces she recognized from her charity events, her committee meetings, her social luncheons, yet none met her gaze directly now. "Shaquille," she greeted with a practiced calm that did not reach her eyes. "I do hope this isn't some sort of spectacle. I have important engagements today." Shaq's voice was quiet but firm, carrying easily across the hush. "This is exactly what it needs to be, Constance. A spectacle of truth. For too long you've hidden behind legal jargon and whispers. Today the town deserves to hear the truth in the open, under the same sun that's warmed us all." A ripple of movement passed through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, others shifted uneasily, on their feet. Constance's mask faltered, just for a moment, but she recovered quickly, drawing herself up with the same brittle dignity she'd used for years to veil her manipulation. "You have no right to accuse me in public like this," she said, her voice sharper than intended. "I have every right," Shaq replied evenly. "This house, this land, it was built by my family's hands, brick by brick, protected by my mother's perseverance. And you tried to erase that. But it's not just about me. I have evidence, documents, testimonies, recordings that show your pattern of deceit. Families pushed out under the guise of legality. Names changed. Histories rewritten. All for your gain. But not this time. This time, your lies end here." Shaq lifted a folder thick with papers, his mother's meticulous records, and the evidence unearthed by his allies. He handed it to Tessa Greer, who stood nearby with a quiet gravity that made even the most skeptical observers lean forward to listen. Tessa read aloud key excerpts, proof of Constance's multiple identities, fraudulent transactions, testimonies from victims who had finally found the courage to speak. Each word landed like a stone dropping into still water, sending ripples of realization through the crowd. Faces that had once turned away from Shaq now turned toward him, eyes wide, mouths set in lines of disbelief and growing anger. Murmurs turned into low conversations, the tide of opinion visibly shifting as the evidence piled up. Even those who had once nodded approvingly at Constance's charity work and social graces now looked at her with thinly veiled disgust. Constance's composure cracked further as she stepped forward, her voice rising with barely restrained panic. "This is slander, lies concocted by a man desperate to save face. You have no proof that would stand in a court of law." Shaq's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "But you forget, Constance, that truth doesn't always wait for the courtroom. Sometimes, it speaks louder in the hearts of the people. And today, they see you for who you are. The documents don't lie. The recordings don't lie. And neither do the people you've hurt along the way." A quiet but growing chorus of assent rose from the crowd. Neighbors who had once avoided his gaze nodded now, some whispering to each other, some stepping closer as if to physically align themselves with him. Even the police officers who had come reluctantly at Constance's earlier behest stood off to the side, their postures tense but no longer aligned with her silent commands. Constance's face reddened, her practiced poise crumbling as she realized the tide had fully turned against her. "You'll regret this, Shaq," she hissed, her voice low but venomous. "You think this town will stand with you? They'll forget by next week." Shaq's smile was small but unwavering. "They won't forget, because I won't let them, and because truth has a way of sticking, especially when it's been hidden for too long." With that, he turned to face the crowd fully, his voice rising, not in volume, but in clarity. "My mother taught me that dignity isn't something you're given. It's something you claim, something you defend with every breath. Today I'm not just reclaiming my family's home. I'm reclaiming our place in this community, our right to be heard, to be seen, and to be respected." A wave of applause, tentative at first but swelling with momentum, broke over the gathering. Some clapped with cautious relief, others with fervent support. Tessa stepped closer, snapping photographs as the moment solidified into something more than confrontation. It became a reckoning, a turning point not just for Shaq but for Willow Creek itself. Constance, her expression twisted with rage and disbelief, turned sharply and strode back to her car, the echo of her heels sharp against the pavement. No one followed her. The crowd remained, their attention firmly fixed on Shaq, who stood tall and resolute, under the afternoon sun, the weight of his family's legacy no longer a burden but a banner of resilience. As the applause subsided, Shaq took a steady breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around him like a mantle. The road ahead would be long, and Constance's influence wouldn't vanish overnight. But today, under the clear light of day, he had shattered her illusion of control. Today he had stood not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or erased. And the town of Willow Creek had borne witness. The late afternoon sun bathed Willow Creek in a warm amber light, the same town that had once turned its back now standing quietly outside Shaq's home, a silent testament to the day's revelation. Shaq stood at the top of the porch steps, the same place where just days ago, Constance Haraway had tried to unseat him from his legacy with forged papers and veiled threats. Now those same steps felt different, infused with a quiet dignity that seemed to rise from the very bones of the house, from every story and struggle it had witnessed. The crowd had thinned, whispers giving way to contemplative silence. Some lingered on the sidewalks, hesitant yet thoughtful, as if unsure how to approach him now that the veil had been lifted. Shaq felt no anger, no desire for triumph. What lingered was a profound weariness, a bone-deep exhaustion from days of battling, not just legal documents, but a system and a mindset designed to erase voices like his. Yet standing there, he felt a flicker of something more resilient than defiance. It was purpose. Inside, the house welcomed him like an old friend. The walls, once thick with tension, seemed to exhale with relief. Shaq walked through each room, running his fingers along the banister his father had sanded, smooth decades ago, pausing by the family photos that now felt more significant than ever. In the living room, he placed the folder of evidence, now bound neatly, back into his mother's old chest, the same one where she had stored the family's most precious keepsakes. He imagined her smile, her nod of quiet approval, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt her spirit settle around him like a protective embrace. That evening, Shaq stood outside once more, watching as the last of the sun's rays dipped below the horizon. Tessa Greer approached, her camera hanging at her side, her expression thoughtful. "I've never seen the town this quiet," she said softly, stepping closer. "You did more than expose Constance. You made them look at themselves. That's not easy." Shaq nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not about easy. It's about necessary. This house isn't just mine. It's a symbol. For my mother. For everyone who's ever been told they don't belong. It stands because we refuse to let it be taken." Tessa hesitated, then asked the question that lingered between them. "What happens now?" Shaq drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle. "Now we rebuild. Not just the house, but the trust, the conversations, the community. I'm not interested in revenge. That would just fuel the cycle that let Constance thrive in the first place. What I want is a reckoning. Not in anger, but in truth. I want this town to face what it almost became. To realize how close we all came to letting lies rewrite history." Tessa nodded, capturing his words in her notebook with a quiet reverence. Around them, neighbors began to return to their homes, the weight of the day's revelations heavy in their steps. But there was also a subtle shift, a sense of something broken beginning to mend, of conversations waiting to be had over dinner tables and morning coffees. The town, for all its flaws, was waking up. In the days that followed, Shaq met with community leaders, not with demands, but with proposals. He suggested town meetings, open forums where residents could air concerns and confront the biases that had allowed Constance's schemes to thrive. He offered to fund educational programs focused on systemic injustice and property rights, using his platform not to isolate himself in victory, but to extend a hand toward understanding and change. Some resisted at first, uncomfortable with the truths they now had to face, but others stepped forward with gratitude, acknowledging their own roles in the silence that had almost cost Shaq his home. Even Frank Delaney, who had once urged caution and distance, approached Shaq with a hesitant apology, offering his support for the initiatives. "I didn't see it before," Frank admitted, his voice thick with regret. "But you opened my eyes. I want to." Shaq accepted his words with quiet grace, understanding that true change was not born of condemnation, but of connection. The town's journey toward reconciliation was only beginning, and he knew it would take time, patience, and relentless honesty. One evening, as twilight draped the sky in deep indigos and purples, Shaq stood on the porch, the familiar weight of the house settling around him like a comforting cloak. He looked out at the town, at the shadows stretching long across the lawns, at the windows beginning to glow with lamplight. He thought of his mother, of the countless families like his who had been silenced or displaced, of the near miss they had all just witnessed. "I hope you're proud, Ma," he murmured into the quiet, his voice steady, his resolve firm. "We didn't just save the house, we saved the story, and now we tell it." In the fading light, the house seemed to glow softly, as if acknowledging the journey that had brought them here, as if standing taller in its place at the heart of Willow Creek. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a symbol of resilience, of justice reclaimed, of hope reignited. And as Shaq stepped back inside, closing the door gently behind him, he carried with him not just the weight of the past, but the promise of a future where truth and dignity would stand unshaken, no longer whispered about in fear but spoken of with pride and purpose. The town might never be the same, but neither would he, and in that quiet, profound shift, a legacy was not just restored, it was redefined. If you've ever felt the weight of history pressing on your shoulders, this story's just the beginning. When justice speaks louder than whispers, when truth shines brighter than lies, that's when change begins. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Stand tall, stand firm, and never let anyone rewrite your truth. Because every house built on courage deserves a legacy that stands the test of time.